All right. Hi, welcome. So, welcome to Goldilocks Decoupled, what the future holds for decoupled publishing. So, I'm Mike Bonetsky, I'm the Director of Technology at 4 Kitchens. You can find me in a lot of places if you look for @Merzu, Twitter and GitHub, and if you start adding U's or to the end on other networks as well. So, what are we going to talk about today? So, some of the hard choices that you have to make when going decoupled. There's a lot of stuff you have to give up. And that sucks, because decoupled is really cool also, and there's a lot of really great stuff you get from it. So that's why they're hard choices. So why developers really love decoupled, and hopefully kind of digging into a little bit of like how that's a thing. When progressive decoupled actually works well as a solution. What publishers want out of all this, and how a couple of other projects have tackled this problem, and then also what a vision for the future, how to bring it all together at the end. So yeah, let's jump right in. So decoupled hard choices. So Dries wrote this really great blog post about choosing whether you should decouple or not. And it has this chart, which is really Byzantine and complicated when you look at it. But it's actually kind of, there's a couple simple choices. I think the chart probably got a little bit more complicated than it needed to. But kind of at the start, it's like, well, are you building a single site, or are you building a hub of multiple sites, or are you feeding lots of other applications? Like, that's the first choice, right? And it's a pretty simple one, which looks actually a lot easier now that if you look at the chart in pieces, it's a great chart. So if it's a single site, then fine. Like, moving on, you're probably gonna just build a regular site. And if it's gonna be a hub, then you start thinking about decouple, especially if there's other apps. That's kind of where that arrow is going. So do you need any of these things? So this is kind of the heart of this whole chart, and what got me thinking about this, and what really made me think that there's like a missing piece to web publishing today. If you want these things, like layout and display management, in-place editing, a toolbar, content workflow and preview, modules, accessible markup, caching and performance, or system notifications, if you want those things, you can't do decoupled. Right? Yeah. I mean, that's like, right? Okay, so kind of like, if you want a content management system, you can't do decoupled. Right? Okay, that's kind of the thing. So then you end up with these choices, and I love the bar at the bottom, more JavaScript. Coupled, you use Drupal in the traditional way. You get like jQuery and Ajax, but there's no like framework behind it. And then progressively decoupled, which is this middle ground, which probably is the least implemented out of all three of these, but probably the most applicable to a lot of situations, and the most underutilized. And then there's fully decoupled. So that's basically like you turn Drupal into a content API and you don't use any of its rendering layers. And that's why you lose all that stuff. With progressively decoupled, you gain a lot of these. Oops. I can only go forward. Hold on. Okay. Last one. Hold on. There. So if you want any of these things, you can't. You can't go decoupled. And if you go progressively decoupled, you don't have like the full weight of and the full advantages of using a JavaScript framework. So in essence, like when you go decoupled, you give up site building and a lot of other features that make administration easy, and then you also give up extensibility and robustness. And like those things are just like the last two are like the important points for developers to remember as to what you're going to give up when you go decoupled. Extensibility, meaning that like your JavaScript framework probably doesn't have a way to install Twitter cards that make sense, or a sitemap.xml. Like, that's going to be work that's going to have to be done, and if you're going decoupled, you have to anticipate those things in your backlog, and etc. Your users are going to have like really limited ability to manage content and how content is arranged on a page, and that's probably a good thing if you're a developer. I don't know why that there's that mentality, but okay, I kind of get it. But yeah, you don't want them to mess with it, sure. Okay, so why do developers want to decouple? There's a lot of good and bad reasons. So first of all, the bad reasons. New and shiny. That is the #1 reason developers want to decouple. And it's a bad reason. Don't decouple. That's why, like, that's the core of what you're, or if you find yourself sort of making up other stuff to justify the fact that it's new and shiny. That Drupal is hard. That's the other thing that always comes up, that Drupal is somehow hard. I don't think it's hard, especially Drupal 8. It's actually kind of a lot easier to understand than Drupal 7. But it's complicated, and it does a lot of stuff. But like, if I could go backwards, I'd go back to that slide and say like, this is all the stuff that it does, and it's like really good for users. Performance. If you're building a really small static site, sure, that's true. If it goes beyond that, it's almost not true ever. And that's because performance, when you get to a large scale site, is a lot more complicated and can't be handled and can't be fixed in the same ways as a static site for a 5-10 page site. It's just a different set of problems. And then there's this other idea that you're going to dog food the API. That's not a valid reason. It just isn't. And I had a good reason why it isn't, but it's just not a really good reason.
What does that mean?
Yeah, there you go. So dog food the API. Well, we want our front end for the website to be a first-class citizen, just like the API for our Android device. So we will build our front end decoupled so that the Android device and the website front end are both feeding from the same API, so that the API for the Android device won't be sort of like left in the dust and won't, that the features for it, like that it's not going to be robust enough to be effective. Does that make sense? And that's just not really true. Because when it comes down to it, you have different problems for each client in a lot of ways, and it just doesn't work out that way. So, and it doesn't really help. So what are the good reasons for decoupled? Share templates and languages between front ends and back ends. That can be huge. And I've seen like the effects of that in developer effectiveness and in ability to create features and in the ability to make things happen. Building front ends in JavaScript using JavaScript frameworks or static site generators is really fast and really easy and awesome to pick up, and it's fun. Like it just genuinely is. Like it's easy to get into. The DX is usually really approachable, and it's also very quick to get results. Static site generators are really performant, and this is a really good reason to decouple if it's a very small site. It's a really bad reason to decouple if it's a really big site, but it feeds into why a lot of people sort of link performance and decoupled as things that go together. And a separation of concerns. Writing a blog post, what you need to do to write a blog post and what you need to do to read a blog post or serve it on a web page are two very different computing problems when it comes down to it. They really are fundamentally different, and it makes sense to separate those concerns. Like your rendering layer for your users and your administration interface for your editors are two different applications. You can build them in the same big monolith, but they really are two separate. Like they really do belong as two separate applications. So what are the other pitfalls? there's a lot more to a website than static markup and content, and this is the problem that a lot of developers sort of fall into when building decoupled sites, is that they forget that their users, even though it may not be on the backlog right now, that they're going to need Twitter cards, that they're going to need an XML sitemap that lists all the pages on the site. They forget that they're going to need all that metadata stuff that SEO companies and like all that things, and they forget that they're going to need a context system and a routing system between pages, especially if you have ads, and so that you can surface relevant ads for relevant content and all that kind of stuff. It's the complexity of a site is much more than just a static set of HTML. So the other problems that you kind of end up with is that I know that at least in this room, both through Lullabot and Media Current and 4Kitchens being represented, there are probably 30 or 40 different ways to build a static site from a Drupal API, right? I mean, we'll take 10, you guys take 10, and you guys take 10, right? I mean, of like weird snowflakes that like maybe have shared some stuff between them, but honestly, like they're all built in different ways. You can't install stuff. There's rarely a plugin system, and there certainly isn't a plugin ecosystem for those types of architectures. Caching and routing. Again, those are like hard things that don't become a problem until the site becomes like more of a more robust than you were anticipating, and there aren't really frameworks that really that do that well. You can build a great static site that has 20 pages. When it gets to 10,000, like things start to fall apart, and you end up working weeks and weeks to solve problems that Drupal has a solution for. All right, so progressive decoupled. How many people here have built a site? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, well, built a site with progressive decoupled as the architecture. Okay, all right, cool. This is probably the most underutilized architecture, and really is like probably the place that like the conversation should really go today. And so the basic idea is that you use Drupal to render the initial page load, and you use a JS framework for the rest of the content. Media Current has built a wonderful module to really support that, and has some great case studies around really big implementations where that worked really well. So the pros are you get to leverage Drupal's tools for layout and page building. Allows for some reuse of templates between client and front end, depending on how that stuff works. And then the routing and caching is in Drupal's able hands, and that's really true. Like Drupal does really do a good job of handling those problems. But there are some cons. It's kind of the redheaded stepchild of a JavaScript framework and a monolithic standalone CMS. You really need a deep understanding of both to be able to add new features to them on the floor level. Like, you know, kind of like adding, making changes to like a widget, or like duplicating a widget. But if you're creating new functionality, you really need to be kind of expert in two very disparate domains to be able to effectively create new features for it. So, and it really works well if there are like two separate teams. Like if you have like a front end team that's doing all the front end stuff, and you have a Drupal team and they're working on the Drupal side of things, and they're working together pretty closely. So that's kind of like if that's what you have in your organization, this is a great fit. So the next thing that I want to go talk about is there are tons of content APIs, and there are 0 ways to render them without a developer. Okay, there are 44 decoupled backends listed on headlesscms.org, and I don't think that's even the tip of the iceberg. I suspect that there are probably closer to 100 to 150 different content APIs, open source, closed source, cloud hosted, enterprise, God knows what, part of a bigger project, not bigger part of a bigger project. Like, it's just everywhere. Everybody's built one of these things. There's a missing piece. There you go. That animation was completely backwards. But anyways, yeah. But there's 0 ways to render them without a developer. Am I the only person that feels like that's just like really weird? Okay, it's like completely strange that like you can't just go on your computer and put in the URL for an API and start seeing HTML. Right? Okay.
Job security.
Job security.
Huh?
Job security.
There you go.
You just have to think it and it'll appear.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can build, so you can, like, there's tools to, like, build a static site and, like, all these, like, Webflow things. You can practically build websites without HTML. I mean, without knowing any coding. But you can't pull anything from an API into those things. I don't know. It's just, it baffles me that that's not a thing. I can only go forward. All right. So what do publishers want? It's a smaller subset of use cases and things and features than I think that than Drupal provides. Drupal provides all this stuff for curating content, and then it provides all this stuff for creating content, and then a workflow management system in there. I mean, it does a lot of different things. But really, when it comes to like a page builder, curate lists of content. So be able to say give me all the articles, after June 2nd that are tagged with a topic. Curate site sections. So to take those lists of content, combine them into a page that makes sense to a user. Bring content together from different sources, so either from your editorial backend and like a Twitter feed or something like that, or from your editorial backend and from your partner publication or your partner who you're providing products that are related or something like that. Layout choices for content, so be able to like set things up and decide how it's supposed to be arranged. Serve relevant ads. And then SEO and social media best practices stuff like that's baked in, and keeps coming up as the last thing because it always is, and also it's like the thing that's kind of baked in that makes like Drupal and WordPress such a compelling tool for publishers. So those things they need, the things that they want on top of that is to be able to create new sites and new sections with existing content without a developer. So to create a new microsite, based on content they already have, or and some stuff about an event maybe. Previews and scheduled publishing of site sections. So both of those things come up all the time, and they really are really important for publishers. Like if you're a high traffic publisher and there's a big news event, you want to be able to see what the homepage is going to be when you make these changes without having to publish that homepage. It makes sense. Personalization, and then there's always iframes. With every publisher, there's always lots of iframes for third-party partners and things like that, and that's never going to go away. Like, it's always going to be part of the deal. So these are the things that are going to come together. So Drupal and open source and content and more general purpose content management systems are not the only place that have been trying to solve this problem. There's a couple who are doing a really good job of solving this problem. One of them is Arc Publishing, which was built by the Washington Post and now is a rather high cost publishing solution specifically geared towards newsrooms. Their page builder was kind of the inspiration for a lot of these thoughts and the big missing piece. And the thing that like really got me excited, and I think everybody on my team has heard me say this a million times already, is that like the first thing that happens when you load up this CMS or this page builder is it asks you where your content's going to come from, and it wants you to put in a URL. And conceptually, that's the missing piece to all this to me, is like, and that's what like this thing should do. You should be able to open up an interface, put in a URL, and start like seeing that content from that URL in templates. That's what they wrote about. And that's where you can actually view it if you want to take a look at it. Their whole wiki is open on the web. It's nice. So another open source kind of version of this is called Superdesk Publisher. So it's a PHP project. It is kind of included here as an alternative to Arc. But it's interesting because it takes that architecture from the get-go. Like their newsroom, their authoring solution, Superdesk, is a separate application than their publisher, which is Superdesk Publisher. That makes sense. There's the URL. So what are the compelling things for publishers with these two systems? They come with a bunch of built-in widgets and things and ways to display your content that can be reused and adapted to your content, all kind of within the interface. So you can kind of say like, okay, well these fields go into these variables in the templates for these widgets, and that's how you, feature an article, and that's how you like display an article page and all that kind of stuff. You can create new sites and sections without a developer. You can do that with Drupal as well. You can't do that in a static site generator, right? You can't do that if you go Decoupled. You can map content from an API to templates without a developer. Like think back to Drupal 7 and feeds and that interface, except not as terrible. So, and it has like really great, really usable tools for managing these pages. They're delightful. So, and ads and social media craft are first-class citizens, and like they come as part of the thing. Like there's no other thing to install. You just have ads, and you have social media, and you have SEO like standard, like out of the box. And you separate content editing and workflow. So you're in. If your website goes down, your editors are still working, and if your editorial interface goes down, your website is still up and deployed to them completely independently. And that's how it works out of the box. Like there's no custom code or stuff that needs to be built or anything like that. That's just the way that it comes in the box. Kind of the disadvantage of these two. So first of all, it's not a JavaScript solution. So all the developers, like one of them's Java, the other one's PHP, probably the two most hated languages. And Arc is an open source. It's actually very expensive. There's no real motivation to support other APIs beyond their own, and there's no ecosystem of add-ons or widgets in either case. So there's no like module marketplace or plugin marketplace or anything like that. There's like developer tools to sort of add things in intelligent ways like plugins, but there isn't an ecosystem around them. So that's what I want to build, or I want us to build, or I think that Drupal really needs, or I don't know, the web in general really needs. So first thing is the welcome screen is a field where you put in an API URL. That's the number one feature. The layout and placement of widgets is in editorial control. So that is built in, that is how it's supposed to work, and it gives all those tools to editors. You separate the content creation workflow from the curation and rendering of pages. So there's no real way to author an article. There's no way to handle the workflow for an article through an editorial process. Like this is just about rendering and pages and things like that. Create a ecosystem of plugins, and DFP is a first-class citizen. So like everything's built around the ability to do advertising well, because that's always the number one thing for every publisher. So why would this be great for developers? Why would you want to use it? It's 100% JS solution, and that's absolutely the language that people want to use. And when you're making stuff for the web, it really makes sense. It is a really great language to use, and it's really grown up as a language in its own right. So declarative server versus client-side rendering. Some of the static site generator packages are kind of taking this this approach, but being able to sort of say like, well, this needs to be part of the initial page load, but this stuff can come later, and being able to just sort of being able to say that instead of write all the code that makes it happen. So the editorial controls are separate and treated like third-party JavaScript from the rendering layer. So if you're not logged in, if you're not authenticated, you don't have any of that, and it's never served unless you're actually logged in and you get that stuff, and then it's all there. So it's not crufted in, it's not part of like the templates and things like that. It's just treated as an add-on layer that can be stripped out just as easily. Built around reverse properties and CDNs, like Drupal does this. A lot of the static site generators are smart about this, but that's an important architectural point. So a standardized development workflow, including hosting, local development environments, and just the whole kit and caboodle. One of the greatest things about Drupal and working on a Drupal site is that you don't have to figure out any of that stuff. And if you have built the site without Drupal, you know that you can, or if you go into this having come up building sites with Drupal, you realize how much it actually just provides for you. Like a routing system is not an easy thing to conceptualize and execute well. A plugin system and things like that. And it's I think the last point that I should add to this would be that it's a standardized workflow across different organizations. So that's the other great thing about Drupal. It's like Lullabot site we can pick up and start working on because we have Drupal developers. And that's what I want Goldilocks to be. Like it's the front end that like we can all sort of glom around. And that's it. So, yeah, what do you think? Should we build this thing?
Yeah.
Huh?
I'm in.
All right, great.
You gotta convince my boss to give me the time now.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I've always thought that progressively decoupled was kind of a range of things, Ajax, blocks that did, calls all the way to a completely decoupled. Doesn't seem like your definition.
I kind of thought it's like pretty much decoupled blocks and that system. I mean, yeah, I guess I don't know. It's just a word. That's like what
you're proposing is not that. You're proposing, a whole beast.
So maybe a better way to answer that is why I see it as as progressive decoupled, and the way that I define it is kind of the progressive decoupled blocks approach. Is that there's a standardized way that that the decoupling happens. So that means that it's not like a range of things. It's like this is the way the JavaScript framework and Drupal work together, and that everything that you build follows those patterns. And that, to me, is what makes it really compelling as an architecture. So whether it's semantics, whether it is like really a term that can include those other ideas, we can leave that up to, I don't know.
Yeah, leave that to me. I actually have got a couple of those.
Yeah.
Would you say that something like the React comments module that was discussed during the keynote this morning is an example of progressive decoupled, in that it's a React component sitting within a larger Drupal site, and it does all the React things, updates, etc. But it's sitting there in an otherwise normal monolithic Drupal site.
Yeah, sure.
So like,
I mean,
weather.com did that kind of stuff, I believe.
Yes.
yes. I don't know. Good progressive decouple, where like it's actually and that's kind of the same problem that I was bringing up about like how everybody's built different decoupled solutions. So building like and I don't know about anything about this module, and I wasn't at the keynote this morning, so apologies for that. But if that's built differently than the way that Twitter built things and is different than the progressive decoupled blocks approach, then we're not winning.
Right.
From my perspective, like how the JavaScript framework works inside of the monolith. There's no matter if it's comments or Twitter posts or blocks that just need to be rendered later and like don't need to be part of the initial page load. Like all those share common problems that should be solved by a common solution, and we should pick one framework and go with that. And like it doesn't have to be a generic thing that supports all frameworks necessarily. You had a question?
Yeah, just kind of commenting to the broad definition of progressive decoupling versus the, I guess, narrow standardized. I would say that it's both. I've taken on some projects with some monoliths where eventually the goal is to go completely decoupled, but you can't do that all at once with a large existing site. So the intermediate solution would be sort of that standardized decoupled blocks, where you are essentially piece by piece exposing API that can later be consumed by a completely separate block.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've also got a couple of projects that we've found that the easiest way to deal with it was to have Drupal render the original content, and then from that point have something like React or Angular or whatever you want to use go in, and then at that point pick up the functionality and change things. And you could do it with Ajax, but when you're doing it on a huge scale, sometimes it is easier just to start with what Drupal gives you in a very basic template, and keep some of those Angular application bits or some of the React components in the Drupal template and work from there. And that's it. It's easy to update. They will at some point, working in that direction, they will probably at some point end up completely decoupled. But it's also a lot of sites that want more functionality, more user touch interactions. That it's really that the data that we need to make those things happen needs to live in Drupal, and it's really heavy stuff. So it's better off in Drupal. But then we can use better, faster, shinier kinds of things to deal with the stuff that the users want to touch. The slideshows that don't just slide, they fade. Or when you're opening accordions and lazy loading the things inside of the accordions, changing the content on the page for what kind of user you're using or some kind of interaction with the user. And it's a much easier, faster, way more fun way to deal with dynamic content after the original load stuff. It's also better for SEO. So, and SEO is really important to the clients, even if we don't generally care.
So on the flip side of that, there have been projects I've been involved in where we did, as you say, Drupal rendered the first piece of it, but really we were having to call out to some third-party integration to bring in all the video or the ad or whatever else it was, and because there were all these things that had to be glued into that component, it was initially rendered by Drupal, and then everything after that was JavaScript and updating the address bar and all kinds of other things going on with that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sometimes you'll look at the templates for some of these pages, and they are really hard to understand because there's a bunch of like empty divs on the page, and those divs, those are there for those connections, and there's nothing in them, and you're just like,
Until you populate them.
yeah, and it's like, what is this template even for? That's why file comment blocks are incredibly important because it's like a div and a div, and then a div called aside, and that's it. And you're just like, what is this? What am I doing with this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just one thing I wanted to ask about, when you mentioned static site generators and not having plugins and things like that, were you taking Gatsby into consideration?
Not having plugins that are related to the API stuff, really. Like the static site generators, they do have plugin systems. Gatsby is a great example. Next is actually another one that's like a really big growing ecosystem of stuff. But again, they start having, it starts to be an architecture that doesn't really work once you reach a certain scale of either site or changes to the site or things like that. So that's, it doesn't, yeah, I'll take that. Absolutely. Gatsby has a great plugin system, 100%. But does that plugin system, it's not
it brings with some learning curve.
Sure. And on that note, I don't know, I don't know if this is just a fluke or anything like that, but as far as learning curves go, my experience has been with our team of developers and also with developers coming from other organizations, that the React stuff appears to be an order of magnitude easier for people to get a handle on than Drupal theming layer stuff, and they're much more apt to do it.
I would say that's a double-edged sword to an extent, because there are those components, when you're grabbing just React components off of NPM, there's so much, sure, it's magic, it just works, but then you've got to dig into your node modules to figure out what's actually being a lot of, I've seen that pitfall for a lot of younger React developers.
Well, and this is, I think, a conversation that we're not having often enough.
Mm-hmm.
You should not be a React developer.
Yeah.
You should be a JavaScript developer working in React.
And
That's, and that's, you see that a lot. People, I'm a React developer and I can use this thing from NPM and I can put this thing on a page.
Well, on that note, how many people here are Drupal developers? How many people here are PHP developers? Okay. And by PHP developer means you've built things in PHP outside of Drupal, shipped enterprise projects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that, yeah, you run into the same problem on in that. I think it is particularly acute with the JavaScript world, and perhaps even more acute with the React and the NPM. I'll just grab this component and oh, that's a dumpster fire, but yeah. You were next.
This whole conversation about JavaScript versus React reminds me of the conversation people were having around Rails and Ruby once upon a time. I'm a Rails developer, but I can't figure out how Ruby actually works. So that brings me back to something I was thinking about as you were presenting. With this Goldilocks system where you can say, this is the API that I want you to represent to me. You drop in the API and let's say you've got several content types that are represented by that API that are maybe backended by a Drupal system. When you start to assemble your mappings of API to template and stuff, is that scaffolding a la Rails used to have, or probably still does? And then you have to find some way to get to that template to override to make it the skin you really want, or how do you envision that?
I honestly, the way I envision that is like all the static site generators just do that as a developer, in declarative, either YAML files or JSON files, and you, instead of just doing it there, you just do it in a form. I mean, it's not like that. That to me was what's so crazy about this missing piece, is that that's it. So it's not it's not like it's the same, like, how do you do that in Gatsby? Well, you just kind of do. It's not a big, it's kind of not that big of a deal.
And then you theme it, but do you ever have markup control over I'm not knowing this particular side?
Sure. No, I mean, I think you have, like, I mean, from what can you do in the interface? You can choose how variables are mapped, right? So you have your internal set of variables and you have your external set of variables, and you say, like, this is that, this is that, this is that, this is that. Like, here's like maybe a plate probably ends up with an additional feature of like having like a little bit of a transform thing, and there you go. And you just kind of put that in the application layer or the UI instead of having it just a developer thing. And all those things are actually just happening on the developer side of things. Like, it's not like it's just adding a UI to Gatsby. That was the other way that I talked about this. And that's what a lot of people need, and that's what also like really propel this kind of architecture into relevance potentially. Because then you can go and say like, oh, well, I have all my content Contentful or something like that. I want to publish my website, and you can just go and do it, and you're done. And you get a theme from, I don't know, Goldilocks Theme Garden. I mean, and the thing is, I mean, you can certainly do this Drupal 7. I honestly don't know what the state of feeds and stuff is in Drupal 8, but with Drupal 7, you could. I bet it's actually relatively easy to kind of to demo this idea. I mean, the user experience is probably painful, but you can actually do it. You can probably just do it in WordPress if you pay $500 for a module or two. But yeah, I mean, it's not. But there isn't a way to do it as a first-class citizen. I think there absolutely should be. And I think that actually it would make a lot of sense for all these sites that really want to be decoupled to have kind of a standardized architecture for sort of building them up. Something that has the ease of entry of Gatsby and the robustness of Drupal, and that's not, I think we've probably all built solutions that sort of do the developer side of that and just kind of put some forms in there, we're good to go.
This almost sounds like the old days of taking Mosaic and saying, I want my headings to look like this, and my font like this, and my color like that. And then any URL I fed to Mosaic came out the way I wanted it to do it. Except putting it on the server.
I don't know Mosaic, so.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm showing my age.
Early web browser.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure, okay, yeah, so like you're doing.
Wix right now.
Yeah.
You know, these-
Well, it's Wix for APIs,
Yeah.
that's the other way to think about it. And it should just be that.
You fed a URL to a thing that I defined what it would look like on the when I viewed it in the browser.
I found out from Weeks ago, because I wanted to see it. I made a friend who were just like, what are you doing?
Right? It's like.
To the other
What are
side.
you doing? It's like, I just wanted to see.
No, I did this. I felt the same way. Actually, I was working on. I was like as far as like how the interface for this should work. I was looking at like a couple of the approaches in WordPress, and like man, by the time I had WordPress installed and some of these modules, and I was like creating a website without doing any coding, I felt like I needed to like hide my head in shame and stuff.
I'm doing it in an incognito window. just
Right,
so
yeah,
nobody
exactly.
can-
So nobody knows. No, but I mean, like, if you look at even the WordPress sort of site building thing, like, as a experiment, just like how nice of a site can you build without writing any code in WordPress? It is really surprisingly good.
You can do surprisingly good things, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not bad. It's not. I mean, it's.
We should probably not have these conversations outside of rooms like this, though,
Well, I mean, I actually think.
The general public will figure out they don't do that.
Yeah. I don't think that I mean, I hope that the decisions that people are making between whether WordPress or Drupal are based on the right kinds of choices and the right kinds of conversations. And we've actually started making WordPress a part of our practice because it makes more sense for certain clients than Drupal, period.
Yeah, I think we're about to take on a WordPress project.
Yeah.
I haven't heard any details on that, but
It's not that bad.
the first job that I did, I was a WordPress developer. I did the front end and the back end for fairly small sites in the beginning, And yeah, so I mean, I've seen it, and it's not. I'm not a Drupal developer, so I'm not really attached one way or another to anything. But you know,
Took me a long time to not be as attached, but now I'm less attached.
I'm
Anyway.
just afraid of some of the WordPress gigs that I've been in where the index page isn't entirely rewritten like scratch spaghetti PHP thing, not even using what WordPress offers.
Yeah.
So whenever you pick up a support gig with WordPress, who knows what you're going to find under the hood is what I'm afraid of.
yeah.
But we vet all of our Drupal sites too for that same reason. we don't take on support clients, you know, like, oh, it's Drupal, that'll be fine. You know, so well, since we're kind of like in this conversation and there's other people here, want to make sure that we can sort of release people. So we can keep talking, but this is the end of the talk. Somebody was waiting for that.